Okay, as Xiaoshan already introduced me, my name is Tiina Törmänen and currently I work as a postdoctoral researcher in the Learning and Educational Technology Research Lab in the University of Oulu. And I will be talking to you today about how I've been exploring students' emotions, motivation, and socially shared regulation in collaborative learning with multimodal data. And first, a short outline of the talk. So first, I'm introducing the lab that I'm coming from shortly and what has been our research interest, and also more in details what I'm interested in my own research. Then I will give you a short theoretical framework of the topic. And then I've prepared empirical examples of a couple of the studies, one that I did as a part of my PhD and another that I'm currently working on as a postdoc. And as I said at the end, hopefully we will have plenty of time for discussion as well. So I'm coming from the LET lab, which is a quite big lab at the University of Oulu in the Faculty of Education and Psychology. And our lab is led by Professor Sanna Järvelä, and we also have 3 other professors working in our lab. We have 4 postdocs, including myself, also university lecturers, doctoral researchers, and research assistants. So we are a big group of people, and I want to highlight that all the work that I'm presenting today is a collaborative effort within our lab members, and mostly I've been closely collaborating with Professor Hanna Järvennoja. But in our research lab, the research interest has been actually already for many years in collaborative learning, and especially in socially shared regulation of learning, which is needed when students and groups are controlling and managing their own and also their group's learning process. And in practice, it means the processes where the students are setting shared goals, planning the use of various types of strategies, and also monitoring, controlling, and reflecting their learning process. And especially during the recent years, our lab has been combining innovative process methods and multimodal data, and also aim for theoretical development. And the main focus there has been how and why socially shared regulation of learning emerges in collaborative learning. We have been studying different types of cognitive, emotional, and motivational sequences and patterns and processes of self-regulated learning, co-regulation of learning, and socially shared regulation of learning. But also, we have been interested in different kinds of conditions under which all of these patterns and processes emerge, and therefore also can afford another or the important cognitive high-level learning processes as well, such as knowledge construction or collaborative problem-solving endeavors. But then where my research is focused on under these large themes that our lab is covering. So my research interest has been mostly on students' emotion and motivation regulation occurring in collaborative learning. And mostly I've been looking at co- and socially shared regulation, and I will walk you through the definitions a bit later. And also, in order to study regulation of emotions and motivation, I've been also exploring both individual and group level affective states during collaborative learning. So how individual and groups are expressing their emotions and how their affective states are situationally changing throughout, for example, one learning task. And currently, I'm also working more on students' motivational beliefs and how individual situational motivational beliefs might also vary within one learning situation. And the focus has mostly been on primary and secondary school. And what has been important in my research is that we've been trying to collect data from authentic learning contexts. And for example, this picture here is from one of the data collections that we did in an authentic science classroom at school. But also our research infrastructure environment is really classroom-like. So we're trying to make the situations quite authentic when we are collecting the data. And in the analysis, but also in the data collection, the focus for me has been mostly in the learning process, which means that the data sources that I've been utilizing have been giving information from the learning process continuously throughout when it progresses. And also the analysis methods that I've been using have been focusing on detecting different kinds of sequences and processes instead of the learning outcome. But then we can go to the theoretical framework more closely. So we know that learning in general, but especially collaborative learning, can be a very emotional context for students. And it can also include various challenges that derive from emotional and motivational causes. And when the students are entering the classroom or entering a collaborative learning situation, they all have individual emotional and motivational experiences that serve as a starting points for their learning and also influence on how they approach the learning situation and therefore also to their interaction during the group learning process. But when the learning process goes on and different types of events take place, it also influences, again, these emotional and motivational states during the learning process, which then again lead back to influencing the students' behavior. And if the students want to strategically influence to their emotions and motivation themselves, then they can use emotion and motivation regulation to do that. And this is sort of the interplay between emotional and motivational states and regulation of learning and group learning process that I've been mostly focusing on in my research. But as I said before, I have been mostly focusing on co- and socially shared regulation of learning. But let's go to the definitions of the different types of regulation first. So we know that regulation of learning, and especially self-regulated learning, includes making adaptive changes to cognition, behavior, affect, and motivation in the face of challenges to enable progress towards set goals. And when individual students are regulating their own individual learning process, we can talk about self-regulated learning. But when we are working in a group and one student supports another student to regulate their learning, we can talk about co-regulation. And when the group together are negotiating and trying to, for example, control their learning process together through negotiating and building on each other's contributions, we can talk about socially shared regulation of learning. And these are the two modes of regulation that I've been mostly looking at. And when I talk about group level regulation later on in this presentation, you know that I'm referring to these two types of regulation. And these are also methodologically a bit different types compared to self-regulated learning when we are trying to study and grasp them, because these forms of regulation always require interaction between students, which can be observable from their verbal interactions, for example, from video data. And that has been my approach in my research. And if we think about regulation of learning, my research has been grounding on the COPES framework by Winnie and Hadfin, which models regulation at the micro level through conditions, operation, products, evaluations, and standards. And this figure illustrates the role of motivation and emotions in COPES framework. So we can see emotions and motivation as internal conditions that influence how students engage in learning. But however, when different operations during learning take place, they also modify students' emotions and motivation, which then again become emotional or motivational products. And prior research has especially recognized socio-emotional interactions, important operations for altering both emotions and motivation, but also the group's socio-emotional climate. And by these interactions, we mean the interactions where students are expressing their emotions or taking other actions that contribute to the socio-emotional aspects of group work. And when, through metacognitive monitoring, students are evaluating their emotional states, they become the conditions for the continuing learning activities. However, if the students notice that their emotions and motivation might be hampering their progress towards their learning goals, they can engage in metacognitive control and use different types of motivation and emotion regulation strategies to control their emotional and motivational state. And that is where emotion and motivation regulation particularly can take place in this SCOPES framework. However, we also acknowledge that when students are engaging in other types of operations, those can also indirectly cause changes in their emotions and motivation. But in my research, I've been particularly focusing on the two types of interaction processes, socio-emotional interaction and regulation of learning as means for students and groups to reform their emotional and motivational conditions. But then we can go to the empirical examples. And first I'm going to present a couple of studies that derive from my PhD research, where I explored students' affective states and socially shared emotion regulation utilizing multimodal multi-channel data. And before we dive into this empirical example more in details, I'll say a couple of words how I've defined emotions and affective states in my study. So we know that emotions are multifaceted and include many different types of components. And instead of using the word emotions, in my study I used the term affective state, which refers to situation-specific responses to the changing environment, including emotions and moods. And in my studies, I have not been detecting distinct emotions, but instead, I've utilized the dimensions of valence and activation as an organizational framework for categorizing different types of affective states according to the affective circumflex model. And another specific thing in my studies has been that I've been looking at how individual students are expressing emotions or affective states in their learning. But we also know that individuals in a group can converge in their affective stage, which can lead to the experience of group level affect. And I've been also looking into this, that how the groups and their emotional expressions align in different situations occurring during collaborative learning. So both individual and group level aspects of affecting collaborative learning. But then to the data collection of these two examples that I'm going to show. So first, in the dataset 1 that I used in my PhD research, we had 31 sixth grade students that were working in 10 groups, and the data collection took place in our LEAF research infrastructure in the University of Oulu. And the students were performing one collaborative science task, and their task was to build a miniature house that makes use of solar energy and is energy efficient. And we were videotaping their collaborative learning, and also to get information from the activation dimension of emotions, where we were measuring the students' sympathetic arousal with electrodermal activity, and in this data collection we used empathic E4 wristbands. And electrodermal activity could indicate the emotional activation, and the video data was used to observe how the students were expressing their emotions in interaction, and either verbally or bodily, and from there I was able to observe their emotional valence. So that's how I got the two different dimensions covered. The second data set was pretty similar in a way, but it included more learning sessions from the groups, and this data set was collected in an authentic science class. So we had 7th grade students that were working in their own classroom, and we were there collecting data across 4 learning sessions, which included collaborative learning. And we had 360-degree video cameras in the classroom, and also each student wore electrodermal activity sensors, so we were able to collect the activation data as well. And this time we used this type of shimmer sensors. You can see it from the picture that the students had electrodes attached to their palms. So it was a bit of a different type of measurement device, but the same electrodermal activity variable was captured. But here is one empirical example where I used the dataset 1. In this study, the aim was to explore the interplay between students' group-level emotion regulation behavior and affective conditions and products of regulation. And in practice, this meant that I first observed from the video data the moments where students were engaging in group-level emotion regulation. So they were regulating their emotions together in their social interaction. And when this happens, it means that the students can participate into these interactions differently. And that is what I mean by emotion regulation behavior. So I looked how each individual student was acting, and I coded whether the student initiated emotion regulation, so recognized the need and started to regulate, or whether the student was participating in already initiated regulation, whether they were just observing and not taking actively part, or whether they were the student who were the target of regulation. So sometimes when we use co-regulation, there can be the person who is offering the co-regulatory support to someone, and I'm calling that someone as a target for regulation in this study. And then I was also analyzing what happened before and after regulation. So before regulation, I was looking from the video data what kind of emotional expressions each student had during 1 minute before regulation, and I coded the valence of those expressions. I also looked whether their activation was high or low, and whether they were participating in the task execution or not. And I also observed the same variables after regulation took place. And then I first analyzed which combinations of affective states and participation students had as conditions for group-level emotion regulation. And I used two-step cluster analysis to do that, because there were quite many variables with different categories, and using all of the categories would have led to quite complex results. So I used clustering to find common properties and clusters of these conditions to make the sequence analysis and process maps a bit more interpretable. Then I used sequential analysis to look at the sequences from conditions to regulation. So how are students' conditions related to their group-level emotion regulation behavior? And finally, I used process models to investigate what kinds of sequential patterns can be found between conditions, emotion regulation behavior, and products of regulation during a collaborative learning process. And here is a reference and QR code for the paper if you want to look the analysis in more details, but I will summarize the results quickly. So what we found is that affective conditions were actually related to students' regulatory behavior. And the students were more likely to initiate emotion regulation in group when they had indicated a personal need to restore their own affective grounds. And in practice, this means that they had expressed negative affect before regulation also themselves. And it was interesting that emotion regulation was also activated to restore participation by targeting co-regulation to non-participating students. And this is an interesting insight to the role of emotion regulation in collaboration, that it can actually be a way to try to restore participation if, for example, the reason for students' withdrawal from the shared activities is emotional, because we know that socio-emotional issues and, for example, conflicts in groups can lead to the withdrawal of students. So this was also interesting finding in terms of that. And emotion regulation did not always change students' conditions, which meant that it was not always successful, even though the students were trying to influence their affective state. But it seemed to be more influential for the students who either were the initiators of regulation or targets for regulation. And this finding nicely demonstrates the interplay between self-regulation of learning and co- and socially shaped regulation of learning. And it seems that in order for this group level regulation to be influential, it also needs self-regulatory awareness of the need for regulation so that you can initiate regulation at the right time, but also co-regulation can help the targets of regulation to also change their affective state through self-regulation of learning. So these were the conclusions that I made from the findings. And another example derives from the second dataset. And in this study, we took a bit of a different approach, and we looked at how students were participating in socio-emotional interactions. So which type of emotions they were expressing in their group's interactions, and how their participation in those socio-emotional interactions evolved across a series of collaborative tasks. As you may remember, in this data set, we had data from three collaborative learning sessions, so we were able to look at it on a longer period of time. And we tried to identify subgroups of students that would have different types of longitudinal profiles. And then we were also interested that whether this socio-emotional profile is related to students' contribution to their group's regulation of learning. So we also looked at if the student had a particular type of profile, was it related to their activity in this group level regulation of learning situations. And in this study, we didn't only look for emotion regulation, but we looked at group level regulation also targeted to cognition and motivation. So all of the regulatory targets that are needed when the groups are regulating their learning together. And here is the visualization of the analysis method. It's quite complex. I'm trying to walk it through fast here, but it's also reported much more in details in the paper. But for identifying their profiles, we use 2 levels of clustering approach. I also recommend looking at the reference by Lopez Bernas and Sager, which also explains this method. But basically, this method is based on multi-channel sequences, and these sequences have been clustered 2 times by using mixture hidden Markov models. So what we did first is that we formed a long multi-channel sequence for each student, and how we coded the data in practice was that we had divided the data into 30-second segments across the collaborative learning sessions, and we looked at students' valence and activation in each 30-second segment, and then formed a long sequence for each student. And then we divided this multi-channel sequence for each student into episodes of 10 sequences and clustered them to reveal 4 different types of clusters of socio-emotional states. So this helped us again to simplify the next steps of the analysis a bit, because we had again quite many different combinations and sequences of the codes. So this way we were able to identify mixed positive, neutral, and negative low states for the students. And then again, we made a sequence for each student using now this socio-emotional state instead of the original codes. And these sequences were then again clustered. And then we were able to find the distinct socio-emotional interaction profiles. And for the second question, how do students with different socio-emotional interaction profiles contribute to group regulation of learning? We used basic key-score tests of independence to look at that. As a result, we found 3 different profiles, which were negative, neutral, and diverse. And which was interesting is that we couldn't find a solely positive profile of the students. And all of these profiles included instances of positive emotional expressions, but neither of these profiles were like consistent in expressing positive affect. And this is really interesting, but nicely also highlights the fact that collaborative learning can be emotionally also quite challenging, and it's natural that there are also this negative affective stage during the process, which students are then expressing. And we were, however, able to find profiles that each had different kind of unique pattern and characteristics regarding emotional balance of participation and also students' physiological emotional activation. And the profiles were related to students' contribution to group level regulation. And interestingly, students with the diverse profile were more likely to contribute to regulation, whereas the neutral profile students were less likely to contribute. And it seemed that the diverse profile students were also quite emotionally reactive. So we speculated a bit this finding in the paper, and it might be that these students also had maybe more value for the learning situation, and that is what made them also to contribute. But it also might be that if we look at this finding in relation to the findings of the previous study that I just presented, it might be so that the students also had the personal need to regulate, and that's why they contributed more instead of the neutral students who seemed to be quite neutral all along and during the 4 different learning sessions. But based on these 2 examples that I just showed, we can ask a question that what do we get and what we maybe miss with this approach that I've been using, which combines video and EDA. And what we get nicely students' emotional expressions, and we can also observe them continuously throughout the collaborative learning process from their interactions. And their verbal interactions also give us really good indication of the group level regulation that is occurring there. From EDA, we can get information of emotional activation through sympathetic nervous system arousal, which is also good and also quite unobtrusive way to also collect data without disturbing the natural flow of the learning process and still get data continuously throughout the learning process. But if we think about the phenomena of emotions and motivation, there is a question that how about students' own appraisals of the learning situation? And for both emotions and motivation, these are of course really, really important, that these define which type of emotions the students are experiencing, and it's certainly a limitation that the approach that I've been using does not cover students' own appraisals. And this leads me nicely to the study that I'm currently working on, where we are studying how regulation of learning builds up students' motivation to learn. And here we have put a much more emphasis also on students' own appraisals and own internal beliefs, for example, and try to also capture them as a part of our multi-modal data collection. So next I will tell you about the research that is now currently really much in progress that I'm now also working intensively on myself. So the project is called Motor, and we also have a big team here involved. The project is led by our professor Hanna Järvenoja, and I work as a postdoctoral researcher. And then we have doctoral researcher Marjo Turunen involved in this project as well, along with our research assistant Emma and our grade master thesis students as well. Shortly about theoretical framework, how we are defining motivation and what are the starting points and the starting ideas of this project. So we know that poor motivation for learning is increasingly recognized as a major challenge in education, and this is of course alarming in terms of, for example, continuous learning and especially in terms of students' well-being. And in this study, we started from the idea that regulation of learning is a key mechanism for students to take charge of their own motivation. And that is why we want to target the gap between motivation research and self-regulated learning research and try to bridge them together in a novel way. And currently, the motivation research has started to emphasize more and more the situated and social processes underlying motivated learning. And in our project, we ground on situated expectancy value theory, which sees students' expectancies for success and subjective task values as the main determinants of their learning motivation in changing situations. However, we also used socially shaped regulation of learning framework to see how regulation of learning, especially in collaborative learning situations, could function as a mechanism for students to change their motivation individually, but also with the support of their peers in the group. We have a quite complex and multi-step research design, and we are currently finished with the first step of the data collection. So I will put our big research questions there. So we are aiming on a bigger level to look how both short and long-term motivation can be associated with regulation, both conceptually and methodologically. So it means that we are trying to look at motivation on a situational level, how it changes, for example, during one learning task, and how it is related to regulation that takes place there. But also we are aiming to look more long-term changes and trajectories of motivation during secondary school. So this is targeted to secondary school students. But currently we have collected multi-channel process data that aims to help us in understanding the situational motivation and regulation a bit better. And in the next couple of years, we start to work with our longitudinal trajectory data collection as well, which will be focusing on the question on why and how learners' motivation changes on a long term, and this will be based more on self-reports. But next, I will tell you how we collected the multi-channel process data this time. So this is a slide demonstrating our data collection. So we had 8th grade students this time, and we had altogether 98 students that came to our university, to our LEAF research infrastructure, to do a collaborative science task. And this was a task that was part of their curriculum, so they would have anyway done this task as a part of their studies at school, but we were able to do it so that they came to do the task in our lab, and we got a really nice data set out of that. But their task was to purify dirty water by using a filter that they needed to make themselves. And the water filtering process included different types of phases, and when those phases were naturally changing, we were also making the students to answer to our situated self-reports 5 times. And the self-report was measuring students' expectancies for success, their value beliefs, and costs. And that is how we were able to get data on their motivational conditions at the beginning of the task, but also how they were changing constantly when the students were progressing with the task. Before the students came to the university, we also gave them more trait-like self-reports measuring their motivation and motivation regulation strategies. So we also have information on that. And when the students were collaborating, we again videotaped their collaboration and collected their electrodermal activity data. And when the task had ended, we performed stimulated recall interviews individually for each student. So we produced a visualization of their situated self-reports answers. So it was basically a curve describing each of the dimensions that we measured. And then we went through this curve with the students and asking them to give reasons, for example, if there were big increases or decreases in some of the variables. And we were then asking what happened and what reasons the students gave to those. And one big question that I at least was really much thinking when we started this study is that how do we motivate students to participate in a motivation study? Because we know that it's not really easy always to get the consent from the students, especially secondary grade students who at least in Finland can suffer from low motivation all in all. And now we are asking them to also to participate in a study in addition to their regular school activities. So we wanted to make sure that the study was well aligned with the things that they would anyway be doing at school. So we collaborated with the school teachers. We had 3 great teachers involved, and they had this type of multidisciplinary learning period going on or planned to be as a part of the students' studies. And the learning period was combining chemistry and biology. And the students were studying and learning about water purification at school already beforehand, and they were also studying the process of how to filter the water. And when they came to the university, we had a lecture from a university professor who is studying these type of water purification processes, and he was giving the lecture for the students to demonstrate how all of this that they are doing at school and now at the university, how it relates to their everyday life. So we tried to make the link a bit more visible there. And the task was also graded. So we tried to make it also valuable for the students this way, that it's not something separate from their study, but part of their graded school activities. And then we also organized a prize draw after each day. So we had students altogether coming to the university on 6 separate days, and every day one student had an opportunity to win a speaker as a prize for taking part of the study. And when the data collection day was over, students returned to the school and they were then examining the purified water there. So their learning period didn't end at the university and into our data collection, but they still continued the topic at school. So it was very, very well tied to their normal studies. But this is a figure that includes a lot of information. Don't worry, I will guide you through the picture soon. But this is made to demonstrate what kind of things we can get out from this rich data set. So We finished the data collection last month, so we have not analyzed the data systematically yet, but we've been starting to explore the opportunities that it brings. But I will now walk you through of the different elements that I've included in this figure. So first, if we think about the video data, we have already started to do some video coding, and we are particularly interested now in locating the moments where students are monitoring and controlling their learning process together. And here you can see an example of one group's video data coding, where we have coded the moments when they are monitoring both their cognition and motivation and emotions, and also controlling them. And this gives us some sort of an outline in terms of regulation of learning, that what is happening there in students' interactions. And also we have coded the lesson structure, so we know when they are doing the questionnaires and when they are executing the task and which space they are in. And here on the left-hand side, we have averages of the students' answers from their trade self-reports in terms of motivation and motivation regulation. These weren't systematically analyzed yet, but here we can see sort of the tendencies that the students have in terms of these variables. And it seems that they are quite homogeneous in terms of that there are not that big of a differences, at least based on the rough average that we took for this purpose. And here on the top, we have situated self-report answers for each student for their expectancies, values, and costs. So here we can see what they answered, and also if there are decreases or increases in their answers. And these are aligned with the different phases of the task, and we can see that what phase they were in and what was happening in terms of monitoring and controlling as well. And here we have students' standardized EDA visualized. This has just been pre-processed and filtered a bit, but not systematically analyzed. But this is just to demonstrate the EDA data, and also from it we can know how emotionally activated the students are, but also how synchronous their reactions are. And here, based on the standardized values, we can see that even visually looking from this figure, that in some parts at least, they are quite aligned. And what I find now really interesting is to look at the part that gives us a bit more indication of the students' reasons for their changes in motivational conditions. And here I have picked some of the elements from the interviews. So if we look at the student that has been marked with black color, we see that the student had quite high expectancy for success throughout the task. So they were really confident that they will succeed in the task well. And when we asked why, the student said that the team spirit was the reason for it, and also that all of them had studied the topic as well as they did at school. So those were the reasons that student gave. If we look at the gray student who has decreasing costs, the costs are not very high at the beginning either, but they are still decreasing a bit when they start to move on with the task. And the student again mentions the group, and that doing the task together was fun, which decreased the costs of the learning task. And the last student, who is marked with orange color, has a high value throughout the task, and also gives some indications about their shared motivation regulation. But if we first look at the reasons for the high value, the student says that they were actually talking together which strategies they can use to remember things well, And also during the task, they were reminding each other that it's important to do well in it so that they will get a good grade. So there was apparently this type of shared value talk going on, and that we know that is a strategy for regulation in motivation. But this last comment relates nicely to interaction that happens here at the end of the task, and I have transcribed the interaction here. So the student said in the interview that at the end, the group was there, that for them it was a bit unclear whether they did the right thing or the wrong thing, but then they just trusted each others. And here is how the interaction goes in this particular moment. So the student Margaret Blackcolor says that I think I did everything wrong. I only studied this for 15 minutes at school. But then the others are encouraging. I think you did pretty well with the filter. Well, yeah, we had a good plan. Then again, the student still doubts and says that I was able to stay in the class for 15 minutes. So apparently they were away for a while, at least when they were studying these topics at school. But then again, the others are encouraging. I have a feeling you didn't do anything wrong. Yes, you didn't. I didn't. And then I trust you too. So they are building the mutual trust and encouraging the one student that they were doing well. And this is also an example of socially shared regulation interaction targeted to motivation and emotions. So this is, I think, a good demonstration of the different parts that we are able to capture related to the phenomena, related to motivation and motivation regulation throughout these different data channels. But I think in terms of the understanding the phenomena, the more important question and the focus is on the interconnections between the different motivational and regulatory processes that we can detect. And this is the challenge that we are also trying to tackle at the moment, that how we are going to use this data to answer to our research questions, and how we are able to combine the data sources with very different granularities on a meaningful way. But I'm, at least myself, really excited to start doing that, because I think that this type of data set can give us information that is much needed at this moment in terms of understanding students' emotions and motivations in collaborative learning, but also understanding these processes in a bit more micro level, and how the actions that students take during the task have an influence on these aspects. But that was my presentation for today, and I thank you for your attention. And I hope that you have now some nice questions to ask, but also some general points for discussion. I would be more than happy to discuss with you related to this topic or anything else that you have in mind. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tiina.
I will now stop sharing my screen so that we are able to see.
Okay, I actually have a lot of interesting pump ups and congratulations for your data collection, but I will set the stage for our audience first. So if Zian and Robin, you have any questions?
Yes, I do. Oh, sorry, Sian, go ahead. Sian, go ahead.
No, you can go first.
It's okay, we have time.
Okay, well, yeah, thank you, Tiina. Thank you for the presentation. This was interesting. This was a little bit complex for me, to be honest. And I come from a different lab than Xiaoshan, and I assume this might be more relatable for Xiaoshan. She does motivation and social emotional and socially regulated learning. Her lab does that kind of research. I come from a different lab. So I have a different question on the aspect where I really liked when your slide, which said how to motivate students to participate in a motivation related study. I really like that title. And your ways of bringing them to the lab, having a prize and a draw competition. that kind of thing was interesting. I wanted to ask, so were there any students who still did not consent to participate, and what activities did you design for them to do if they were like during that period when the others were participating in the study?
That's a really good question. Thank you for that. And of course, there were students that weren't willing to participate. And that's also, I think, important question in terms of ethics, because we need to make sure that this is voluntary for each student, but also that we are not excluding the students from the activities if they are not consenting. So what we did was that every student, even though they didn't participate in the study, they came to the university and they were listening to the lecture and they did every other activity that we had. But when we were collecting the data, we had a separate room for those students with the same equipment, but we just weren't recording them.
Okay.
So they were like doing the same thing, but without the cameras and sensors and stuff.
Yeah, gotcha. Thank you. That's all. That's the one thing I wanted to ask.
Yeah, but that's interesting also in terms of like, because we did this data collection in spring and also again in autumn, and we had same teachers but different students. And first time our like participation percentage was like really high. We only had a couple of students who didn't participate. But in the autumn, there was particularly one classroom that like half of the students declined. But in the other classrooms, almost everyone participated. And it would be a cool thing to study how this kind of attitude of not participating or participating starts to spread in the classroom, because it's really like, for me, it seems that it's only based on like luck. No matter if I give the same introduction in the same way, and it's just like, I think it's about the students and some social relationship things there that who will take
for sure.
or not.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that was because I also asked this question because like when I was trying to design and put in my ethics application, I wanted to see, okay, how do I go about, what will I have the students who do not consent to participate, what do we have them do? So yeah, I think this was really interesting approach where you had them doing the same activity, so they're participating in the same thing, just not collecting their data.
Yeah, and previously I've been collecting this type of data set quite many times. We have had the approach that the students who are not participating don't come to the data collection at all, and then while the others are doing the data collection, they're doing the similar things with their teachers. And also in the study where we were in the actual classroom, we have used room dividers to like block the students from the video so that we are able to be in the same room but not recording them. So there are many options, but I think it's important that you are providing the same activities for everyone.
Thank you. That's all.
Thank you, Robin, for this interesting and practical question. Yeah, and Zian, you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Tiina, for this wonderful presentation. It was pretty informative to me. Okay, but I have some questions. First of all, do you have, like, after all the research, do you have any implications for the teachers about how to enhance the students' socially shared regulated learning, or like how to foster their group collaboration?
Thanks, that's an important question, and I can answer especially based on the my PhD research that I did that was targeted to emotion regulation. I think the first implication, I'm now talking in the Finnish context, obviously, because I had Finnish students involved, but it seems that collaborative learning seems to be quite emotional. At least in our context, it included many negative emotional expressions, but not that much regulation. So it seems that the student, at least on this age, are not really good in regulating their emotions in collaborative learning situations. And that is the message that I want to give, that it should be something that teachers should be aware of and also more strategically try to support. And how to support that, then this actually derives from another study that I didn't present, but it was a study where we found out that when we looked at the progression of the learning session in terms of socio-emotional interaction and emotional valence, we found out that if the groups were able to form positive affective state at the beginning of the learning task, they were more frequently also regulating when they faced negative affective states and challenges. So the implication derived from that could be that it might be important to give the students at the beginning of their collaboration room for positive socio-emotional interaction, meaning that we might also think that we don't go straight to the learning activities, but give them time to catch up if they don't know each other, to get to know each other a bit, use maybe some sort of icebreaker activities, and try to build a good atmosphere there for the students to work together. And that was another implication that I've been highlighting there. And to continue with the project that we are now working on, we don't have practical implications yet because we haven't analyzed the data, but what we are aiming to do in the next phase, we are hoping to have some sort of intervention for the teachers at some schools that will be involved in our data collection. And we are trying to use the data that we have now to come up with the ways that they could try to support the students, and maybe we can then analyze how effective those ways seem to be. But we really are trying to also find the implications and ways for the practice and for the teachers to use in the classroom.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you. But I also wonder, does the group size affect the socially shared regulated learning or their collaborative learning?
Thanks for the question. That's actually a really good and important one, which I don't know, Shershan, do you know that if someone has systematically analyzed that? Because I don't think anyone has, so I cannot answer to that directly. Just this is not like a systematic result of the analysis or anything. This is just my observation while looking at the different data sets with different group compositions. That of course that when you have a much bigger group, it doesn't require contributions from individuals that much. So it might affect that way, but especially if I compare the groups of 3 and groups of 4, in groups of 4, it sometimes happens that the students go to work in pairs. So they start to kind of having discussions with the pairs instead of the whole group, and that doesn't happen that much in 3 members groups. So it would be interesting to look at whether this actually affects, for example, to see how well the group works together or how equally they participate in for example, regulation activities. So, and based on the research of my colleague who is actually studying the participation in group level regulation, her, I think, first paper, the result was that or I think the conclusion from the result was that if the whole group participates actively, it's more likely that there is also socially shared regulation occurring. So it seems to require the active participation, and if it comes from the whole group instead of only part of the group, that seems to be important.
Yeah, that's very insightful. Maybe we can do a meta-analysis on the studying as socially regulated learning together, to compare their effect size to see if whether group size do have an impact on that. So
Yes.
My dissertation, I collect pairs study, so it won't happen one member is off task or they are not talking. Yeah, so it's interesting to see that the difference between 4-member group and 3-member group. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. One last question. Sorry.
Go ahead. No. It's we are learning from each other. That's a nice group climate.
Yeah, and I'm happy to answer the questions. And I'm sorry that I took a bit longer time for the presentation.
No, it's totally fine if everyone's.
But I'm not in a rush, so please go ahead and ask questions.
Okay. Thank you for your time. This one might be a little bit off the topic, but I'm curious that because I felt like all of your research is based on face-to-face collaborative learning, right? So I'm curious that if a change to online learning or online collaboration, does that influence the result?
That's a interesting question, and I think that I haven't been systematically analyzing that. And again, I cannot say that anyone has been really systematically looking at that if it influences the results, but I've been discussing my results in relation to the studies that have been done in the online environments. For example, Alison Hadwin's team, I think they have been having this data that is collected in online environments, and Aisha Bakhtiar studies, at least they are touching the pretty similar concepts that my studies, and I think that the results mostly seem to align. But of course, in terms of the interaction, it might be really different, especially if the interaction goes through chat logs instead of like having a Zoom meeting, let's say. But I think that's also a direction that we should maybe move forward, and in general as well, because I think that's what especially the results or the research related to motivation and emotion is highlighting currently, that we don't have that much information on how these findings generalize from one context to another, or from one situation to another, because we know that these processes are really situation and context specific. So in that sense, looking at also more systematically face-to-face and online context would be a really good and needed research idea, but also, let's say, comparing the results that we get and, for example, you get in Canadian like schools, because the context might matter there as well.
Yeah, I agree. Well, thank you. Thank you for answering all of my questions.
Thank you for
Thank
the
you
questions.
for those, yeah, thank you for those great conversations too. So